Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar focused on addressing the housing needs of youth and young adults in contact with the justice system. My name is Emily Morgan, and I'm from the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and we're really excited to be bringing you this webinar, an exciting set of panelists to talk about this really important issue. And this webinar is really co-hosted by the Justice Center as well as the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. So today we have with us some really terrific panelists. First we have Jasmine Hayes, Deputy Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. We also have Naomi Smoot, Senior Policy Associate with the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, and Beth, Holger-Ambrose, Executive Director with the Link. So just a quick overview of our webinar this afternoon. I'll provide a quick overview of the topic and then quickly hand it over to Jasmine, who will provide sort of the federal landscape on this issue of addressing the housing needs of youth and young adults in contact with the justice system, opportunities and next steps at the federal level. Then Naomi will talk about the state and local perspective and promising strategies to address the housing needs of these individuals. And Beth will provide an on-the-ground perspective of what has worked and what hasn't worked in terms of housing and providing stable and secure housing for youth and young adults in contact with the justice system. And then we'll try to leave around 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. But really encourage everybody. We have a bunch of folks on the line, and we really want to make the most use of our time. So if everybody could, throughout the presentations, as questions come up, if you don't mind entering those into the chat box, we will try to get to as many as we can. And just as another housekeeping item, this webinar and the PowerPoint will be archived on our website shortly after the webinar. So with that, we'll get started. So a little bit of background on the Council of State Governments Justice Center. We're a national nonprofit, nonpartisan membership organization, and we serve policymakers at the state, federal, and local levels from all three branches of government. We provide practical advice and consensus-driven strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. And one of the projects of the Council of State Governments Justice Center is the National Reentry Resource Center, or the NRRC, which is administered by the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and was established by the Second Chance Act. And the NRRC really serves as the primary source of information and guidance in reentry. And through the NRRC, the Justice Center has provided individualized training and technical assistance to over 600 juvenile and adult grantees that received Second Chance Act funding to support successful reentry and reduce recidivism. So as you'll hear more about from our presenters, one of the most significant challenges to successful reentry for both youth and adults is securing stable, affordable housing. And so this is just a quick overview of some of the barriers that exist for youth. We know that many are disengaged from their families. They don't have supportive family environments to return to. We also know that a significant proportion of youth involved in the juvenile justice system are simultaneously involved in the child welfare system. Some estimates upwards of 60% are dually involved. And also substance use and other behavioral health conditions can pose additional challenges to maintaining housing. And as a result, many youth who have been involved in the justice system experience homelessness at one point or another. And while youth face significant housing challenges, young adults, which we're defining as 18 to 24-year-olds, involved in both the juvenile and criminal justice and adult criminal justice systems because of their age, perhaps face even greater obstacles. So first of all, if they're dually involved in the justice system and the child welfare system, they're potentially aging out of both of these systems during the same time period, and so that can be really traumatic and challenging to try to kind of go out of those systems without a secure safety net. And because of their age, they're often viewed as an adult and expected to be self-sufficient, despite having little or no experience living independently. So that's another kind of challenge that they face because of their age. Secondly, young adults involved in the justice system face challenges to finding steady employment. and without a consistent source of income, it's difficult to find and kind of maintain housing. We also know that substance use peaks during young adulthood and certain mental health conditions emerge during this time period, presenting further challenges. And for young adults who are in the criminal justice system, a criminal record can also limit their housing options, as most housing applications ask about a criminal history, and landlords and subsidized housing providers often have the discretion to deny people who have criminal records. So we know that there's some efforts underway kind of focused on youth in the juvenile justice system, and in an effort to shed light on the need to also work on improving outcomes for young adults, who are typically the highest risk, highest need population, the Justice Center released an issue brief last year highlighting how young adults are distinct, discussing their distinct needs, including housing and transitioning to independence, and then providing some recommendations on how to improve outcomes for this population, which includes better coordination across justice, child welfare, education, and employment systems, more research on what works, particularly as it pertains to housing and transitioning to independence, and also advocating for better data collection on young adults so we can see what happens when they return to their communities, what's working, what's not, and help target improvement efforts and resource allocation. So if you haven't already taken a look at this publication, we really encourage you to do so. And with that, I want to turn it over to our expert presenters who are going to kind of dig in a little bit deeper on this topic. So first we'll introduce Jasmine Hayes, Deputy Director for the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. And again, want to remind all of you throughout the presentations to really put your questions into the chat box, and we'll try to get to them as many as we can. Thanks. Jasmine?
Our research and our work tells us that there are multiple pathways into youth homelessness, and you've heard a little bit about that today. Two of the most significant are the pipeline from the justice and child welfare systems. So over the next 15 minutes or so, I'll be giving the federal perspective on youth homelessness, as well as noting our priorities to sustain and further advance our progress, particularly as we're preparing to transition into a new administration in approximately 6 months. I'm sure many of you recognize this document, Opening Doors, the Federal Strategic Plan to Prevent and End Homelessness. The plan has 4 goals, and the population we're focused on today falls under the 3rd goal of preventing and ending homelessness among families, children, and youth in 2020. The results to date are clear that Opening Doors and our implementation of the plan are working. According to HUD's 2015 point-in-time count, the total number of people experiencing homelessness at any given point in time had been reduced by 11% since 2010, the year that the plan was released. Further, unsheltered homelessness had been reduced by almost 26% over the same time frame. At the same time, while there has been significant progress, there's clearly more work to be done across our federal agencies to achieve greater reductions in homelessness. There are also significant geographic disparities in the progress that has been made, and recent Department of Education data has indicated an increase in the number of students experiencing homelessness over the course of the school year among both unaccompanied youth and families with children, and I'll talk about the role of data in a few minutes. Briefly, the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, or USICH, is an independent agency charged by Congress to lead the coordinated federal response to homelessness. And we drive action in a variety of different ways. So here in Washington, we provide policy leadership at the secretary level and throughout agencies to institutionalize the work around homelessness. And then we also have a robust presence in the field through our National Initiatives team, which includes 4 regional coordinators who work directly with states and local communities. Moving forward, our council priorities in 2016 include sustaining the systems that have led to our success in ending and preventing veteran homelessness across many communities and 2 states, and applying those lessons learned to strategies for ending homelessness among other populations, including unaccompanied youth. We are also focused on implementing regional strategies to engage key mainstream systems to address homelessness. We know that the targeted system alone is not sufficient to prevent and end homelessness. We're working to scale up engagement of state Medicaid programs with housing agencies to expand the supply of permanent housing necessary to end chronic homelessness, which is an issue for many of the individuals who are exiting the justice system, and continuing to strengthen the integration of federal programs to end youth homelessness through the implementation of technical assistance and a new federal funding opportunity, as well as dissemination of capacity building tools and performance measures to improve the interventions that are provided to youth. Today's discussion is grounded in the experience of youth, particularly youth who are at risk of homelessness, and we have some understanding of why youth become homeless. When families become unstable due to internal conflict, lack of acceptance of LGBTQ youth, substance misuse or mental health issues, economic hardships, domestic violence, abuse or neglect, young people can find themselves in unsafe or unhappy circumstances that lead to them leaving home or being forced out. Youth who are experiencing homelessness include groups who are overrepresented. And for example, an estimated 20 to 40% self-identify as LGBTQ, and this high rate is due in part to family conflict and rejection. And then, as Emily noted earlier, involvement in public systems like child welfare and juvenile justice also increases the risk of youth homelessness, particularly in the absence of planned and supportive transitions out of these systems. Unlike other social services in the U.S., efforts focused on serving youth experiencing homelessness or who are at risk of experiencing homelessness do not have a coordinated system of supports through a single state or federal agency. So instead, individual providers have to procure and operate with a combination of federal and non-federal funds. And that means there are also a number of different data sets that we have to look across in order to understand how services are being accessed and what services exist. Sharing of data across systems helps to paint a more complete picture of homelessness, in this case homelessness among youth, than the information gathered by different systems alone. Point-in-time counts provide us with a snapshot of the number and demographics of people who are experiencing homelessness at a given point in time and can be used to help determine the day-to-day capacity we need within our crisis response systems and as an indicator of progress and the impact of strategic activities. So for example, HUD's most recent, the 2015 point-in-time count estimates tell us that on a single night in January 2015, there were approximately 46,000 to 47,000 unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness, including parenting youth. But we know that in and of itself, this data does not provide enough information to guide the strategic decisions and inform the interventions that we need to end homelessness, nor is it the complete picture. Annual data provide a good indicator of how many people receive help from homeless assistance programs, schools, and other service delivery systems, including the juvenile justice system, over the course of the year. Programs also collect more detailed information about the characteristics of the people they serve, so annual data can provide better information about people who receive assistance for varying lengths of time during the year. HUD's release of the 2014 AHAR Part 2 report, which is an annualized report, last fall, helps to provide a fuller picture of the state of homelessness in the U.S. And this creates an opportunity to bring to focus what that data, along with other federal data sources, tell us. The other data sources that HUD has discussed within the AHAR, for example, the American Housing Survey, helps to document and estimate the number of people who are living in overcrowded situations or living with other people temporarily. It includes information about the reasons people are living with others, and then it's used to document the worst case housing needs in annual reports to Congress. Department of Education data was also included in the AHAR Part 2. Ed data captures information on students who are enrolled in public schools identified as experiencing homelessness at some point during the school year. So in the 2013-2014 school year, there were approximately 1.3 million students identified, the vast majority of which were living with families in doubled-up situations. And of these 1.3 million students, approximately 90,000 were unaccompanied youth. We also look at the runaway and homeless youth data on the HHS side, which tells us that in FY 2014, the Family and Youth Services Bureau's Basic Center program provided emergency shelter for more than 30,000 youth on the streets, and their transitional living programs helped nearly 3,000 homeless youth transition to life on their own. So at the federal level, there are multiple efforts to support state and local efforts to strengthen data collection and data sharing. So as communities have a better sense of the data that exists, it can help to inform their planning for how best to target and prioritize resources, as well as identify where there may be a gap in serving particular populations or where there are limited types of interventions. Local continuums of care already have a Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS, in place. And among its capacities, HMIS is designed to document and report on housing and services provided to individuals, including youth experiencing housing crisis within a geographical area. The Runaway and Homeless Youth Management Information System, or RIMUS, used by RHY providers, is now actively integrating its data with HMIS data in communities across the country. So combining these robust information systems will be invaluable both in supporting success of individual youth and supporting effectiveness of system-level planning and coordination. So using data to inform policy decisions and program design is without a doubt an iterative process. USICH and our federal partners are committed to continuing to improve the data we have that's available and then to analyze and consider it in new ways on an ongoing basis. I'm going to move from the larger population of unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness and focus in on the intersection with child welfare first, because we know that many of the young people we're talking about today have a history or are currently involved with the child welfare system either through foster care or as an in-home case. And while the majority of children who exit foster care across the country annually are reunified with a parent or primary caretaker, we have approximately 23,000 young people who age out of the system each year. That means they did not exit to family or some other form of positive support. And among these youth, there's a high prevalence of homelessness, and that's confirmed through a number of the research studies that you see listed on the screen. As noted earlier, the intersection between youth homelessness and juvenile justice is not unlike that for child welfare. So given the challenges already facing unaccompanied youth, we understand the increased risk and vulnerability they have for engaging in activities that may lead to increased involvement with the justice system. And then further compounding what is already a difficult transition are the associated challenges with reentry, which range from lack of a safe and stable home to disengagement from family or other strong supports, and for many of the young people, unaddressed trauma and a lack of behavioral health services. We've talked a little bit about the intersection with homelessness and involvement with public systems, and I also want to highlight the overlap between youth involved in child welfare as well as with the justice system. Not only are youth involved with child welfare at higher risk of experiencing homelessness, they are also at increased risk of becoming involved with the justice system. And similarly, young people who become involved with the justice system are increasingly likely to end up involved with child welfare. This involvement with multiple systems, neither of which is equipped to provide youth with the supports and services that a safe and stable home should provide, disproportionately impacts our young people of color, especially our young boys. Many of these youth struggle with getting to the same school consistently, and they often struggle in school. They have significant trauma histories, most of which is unaddressed, and ends up impacting their current behaviors and future outcomes. And for so many of these young people, there are extended stays in foster care and involvement with child welfare that tends to end not because they've been able to reconnect safely with family or kin or in another permanent setting, but because they have aged out of the system. So knowing what we do about the contributing factors and intersections with multiple issues, it's clear that youth experiencing homelessness are diverse, as are their needs. And preventing homelessness or the recurrence of homelessness requires interventions that are tailored to the needs and strengths of youth, and this starts with individual assessments and related planning. For youth under 18, the primary intervention is reunification with family or other natural supports where safe and appropriate, while ending homelessness for youth over 18 may require more varied interventions, so from short-term to longer-term housing with varying levels of support and engagement in services, including education and employment. But even for those youth that cannot return home, it is still critical to help them build and maintain connections to safe and supportive adults in their lives. Opening Doors recognizes that by forming local partnerships, communities can better identify, engage, and respond to the needs of individuals and families, including youth who are experiencing homelessness. And it's this commitment to collaboration that guides programs addressing homelessness supported under our member agencies, including HUD, HHS, Education, Labor, and the Department of Justice. Active cross-systems collaborations establish a foundation from which both homeless service programs and mainstream services providers can most effectively address the needs of individuals. And the guidance we released last year lays out our shared vision for a comprehensive systems approach and the components that are part of this. The first area is about the overarching planning we need to do at the federal level. So we're working to clearly articulate what we're trying to reach in 2020. So what does it mean to end youth homelessness? And then we need to identify the metrics to help monitor our progress to answer the question of how will we know how well we're doing. We're developing preliminary modeling projections about what resources are needed, what gaps need to be filled, and what new investments need to be made, recognizing that this will require continuous refinement as we learn more about the solutions and get new data points. The work we're doing on the data side is going to help inform the kind of guidance and technical assistance that states and local jurisdictions will need to support a coordinated systems approach. So consistent messaging, clarity on the resources that are available and how they can be used, this is all part of building a foundation for the work. The second strategic action area is about the preliminary, coordinated, and comprehensive community response we've identified. And the challenge is how do we build the capacity of communities to implement this response. As mentioned earlier, we know that family conflict is one of the main reasons, including for LGBT youth, become homeless. We also know that most youth will exit emergency shelters back to their parents or to their home of origin. So one of the most important strategies we can pursue when it's safe and feasible is to support families and youth so they reunify as quickly as possible or prevent youth from leaving home entirely. And based on the number of public system involved youth, it's critical to ensure that as young people are leaving the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, they're connected to stable housing along with access to all of the mainstream programs, including education, employment, financial supports, as well as permanent connections and supportive services. And we also know that schools are one of the best places to identify youth and their families who are experiencing or at risk of homelessness, and then to connect them with essential services, including housing. As communities around the country establish coordinated entry systems, it's important for federal agencies to assist them in identifying and implementing the tools that take into account youth-specific vulnerabilities, and then placing youth in the appropriate low-barrier housing and services, prioritizing the most at-risk youth. And here is a perfect example of where the connections to the juvenile justice service providers and local continuums of care is critical. We know that assessing youth needs has to be something that's done on an ongoing basis, responding to the changes that occur over time as part of their development. Services need to reflect age and level of need. They should be trauma-informed and support a positive youth development approach. To improve the odds of success for youth reentering the community, the justice system, related agencies, and communities should be planning for what needs to occur for reentry when youth enter the juvenile justice system. So this is the same approach for planning when youth are in foster care. We should be thinking about exit on day one. The multiple systems that youth are connected to should be talking to one another and coordinating efforts throughout a young person's involvement with this justice system. And this means starting at the entry phase. So from the moment the youth enters a residential placement, continuing through their placement and transition, and actually all the way through extended supports under aftercare. And you'll see this aligns with the coordinated community response that I just walked through. Before I close out, I thought it would be helpful to provide a very brief snapshot from the federal perspective of a number of priority actions we're undertaking to strengthen both policy and practice. Earlier this year, USICH submitted a report to Congress on how federal programs that serve youth experiencing homelessness can be better coordinated, and this helped to inform the shared vision of the coordinated community response. Later this year, HUD will be releasing a notice of funding availability for a 10-community demonstration project. The learning from this effort will add to our understanding of effective interventions and help to identify innovative practices as well. There's also been and continues to be a focus on data sharing and understanding relevant data sets and how to access and use them. And as I discussed earlier, there are multiple sources of data that can be analyzed to give us a clearer picture of youth homelessness including the pathways in and out of homelessness. In terms of guidance to the field and what's particularly relevant to today's topic is forthcoming guidance to support the implementation of coordinated entry for youth. This year, the Family and Youth Services Bureau published a screening and assessment inventory, which can be useful for informing the need for interventions and services. And later this year, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Programs at the Department of Justice will be publishing a reentry toolkit for juvenile justice to support youth, communities, and service providers across multiple domains for youth exiting juvenile justice programs. So with that, I'm going to thank you again for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion, and I'll go ahead and hand things over to Naomi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. By way of background, I'm with the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. We're a national membership organization. We have a network of about 9,000 juvenile justice advocates that we work with across the country. Our primary membership are the state advisory groups, which are governor-appointed bodies that administer federal juvenile justice funds at the state level. And we're very excited to be on today's webinar and also about a new project that we're going to be launching later today that focuses on the intersection of juvenile justice and youth homelessness. And when I talk about youth homelessness, from CJJ's perspective, we use the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act definition, which just by way of background is defining homeless youth as any youth who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And we focus specifically our work on those unaccompanied youth, kids who are out without a home, without their families, and without those support networks that many children rely on and have available to them. You know, we're talking about children who are living in hotels, motels, on the streets, and those kids who are couch surfing and may not have a stable and secure place to live. Nationally, the estimates for annual unaccompanied youth is about 380,000 children under the age of 18 will be without a stable and secure home for some period of time in a given year. And again, we're looking at those kids, that 380,000 number is looking at kids who are under 18 specifically. And I point that out because definitions can vary widely. Some definitions include youth up to 24, and in part that's because of jurisdictional challenges that arise within the juvenile justice system. We all know that most states consider folks minors until the age of 18, and that most states keep kids in the juvenile justice system until the age of 18 as well. But there are some outliers that are below that age still at 16, 17 years old. And depending upon jurisdictional issues, for example, here in DC, you can, if you're already under the court's jurisdiction, you've come before them before for a case, for example, you can remain under the juvenile court's jurisdiction until age 21. So that's why those numbers can vary from 18 to 24 that you hear. And we know that about 1 million kids a year come before the juvenile justice system. So it's a pretty large number, and not all kids who are homeless are going to have contact with the juvenile justice system, but a fair number of them will. You see before you a slide that explains that there were about 654 runaway and homeless youth who were interviewed from 11 cities across the country. And those interviews revealed that about 44% of those kids had stayed in a jail, prison, or juvenile detention center at some point. 78% of them had had interaction with the police, and 62% of them had been arrested at some point. And there are a broad range, as we've heard, of reasons why kids can come into contact with the juvenile justice system, and a lot of commonalities between the populations that we see who are homeless youth and who are kids who are before the courts. Large number of those commonalities exist in terms of disproportionality. Minority children are more likely to come before the juvenile justice courts, and they're also more likely to be homeless as well. And as Jasmine mentioned a moment ago, there's a disproportionate number of youth who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender who are homeless. About 20 to 40% of all homeless youth are LGBTQ youth. And that can be because of parents who force children out of their homes and other related issues. So, juvenile justice and homelessness, we have a great tool that's coming out later today. It's a roadmap of kind of how you can identify children and how you can help give services, because our goal with our project at CJJ is to make sure that kids don't become homeless as a result of their contact with the juvenile justice system, and that they're not criminalized for behaviors that result from their homelessness, that they receive the services and supports that they need. We know that some young people are homeless before they enter the system at all. So this is kids who have run away from home, and then there are other kids who are forced out as a result of their system involvement. And this can involve kids who may be living in public housing. We know that HUD has very narrow limitations on what is allowed to be prohibited in terms of, once folks exit the system and whether or not they're allowed to stay in their home. But individual housing authorities vary greatly, and we know that folks can be rejected when they apply for housing because there's been someone living in that unit who has previous system involvement. We also know that there are some kids who just simply aren't picked up when they are exiting a juvenile detention facility. And one of the things that can help us address these issues is really well-developed transition plans, right? We encourage states to begin to have transition plans in place and to develop them as soon as a child comes into a detention facility, so that we can make sure that kids are going to have stable, safe, secure housing when they exit. And another thing to keep in consideration there is making sure that there's educational opportunities in place for the child to return to once they have exited the facility, because without quality education and vocational training in place, there are a number of additional concerns that can arise because children, obviously might not have access to employment if they haven't obtained the skills and the training that they need. And while we're on this slide, before I move on to the next one, I just want to remind folks that it's important when a child comes before the courts, or when you're working with a child in school, or maybe you're a coach in your community, to really be thinking about the child and trying to identify them to make sure that you can get services to a child who might be homeless, as opposed to having to have them fall within the juvenile justice system and be criminalized and penalized for those behaviors. So what are some of the ways that kids can be criminalized and penalized for their behaviors while they're homeless? Quality of life ordinances. We all know about laws that exist that say you can't sleep in a public park after dark. And here I would also point out that there's a lot of curfew laws. Many cities and states have curfew laws in place to make sure that kids aren't staying out late at night. If you don't have a safe and secure place to go home to, though, those curfew laws can really disproportionately affect you. And that's what we see with homeless youth, that if you don't have a place to stay and you don't have a place to live, there's really no legitimate way for you to comply with those laws. Survival crimes. Some people who are homeless may turn to shoplifting or trespassing to try to get food to eat, or to try to get a safe and warm place so that they can sleep out of the elements. We also know that a number of children who are homeless engage in survival sex in order to try to obtain shelter or food or other necessities of life. And as Jasmine mentioned, family violence can also lead to homelessness and can be intertwined with youth homelessness. Children may run away from home, try to get out of those violent situations that they're facing so that they have a safer place to live. And again, collateral consequences. We know that, public housing in particular has limitations, and there are folks who may be turned away because they or another member of their family have a prior conviction, which can cause children to be forced out of their homes. So one thing that states can do in terms of trying to address these issues is, while you're making your state or your local laws or considering revising them, keep these sort of issues in mind so that we can try to reduce the number of children who fall within these legal ramifications. And again, another way that folks can come into, that youth can come into contact with the juvenile justice system as a result of their homelessness is status offenses. And status offenses are behaviors that are illegal only because the person engaging in them hasn't yet turned 18. And frequently, these things can include truancy, running away from home, skipping school, not obeying a parent's rules, and then also liquor law and tobacco violations in some states are considered status offenses as well. And running away from home, especially for homeless children, it's criminalizing them for being on the streets. And these laws fall under a variety of different names in different states. They can be called person in need of services laws, family in need of services laws, children in need of services. There are a variety of different names and different labels for these offenses, but the ramifications are still the same, especially for children who are homeless. And there are several federal laws, but I wanted to highlight for you the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Act and Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act in particular. This one has 4 core protections for youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system. When it was initially enacted back in 1974, it included the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, which, as folks know, includes funding for shelter programs and drop-in programs for runaway and homeless youth. That provision of the JJDPA has now been separated and put in its own law and reauthorized separately. But the JJDPA core protections include sight and sound separation, which means that kids and adults can't be put in the same jails, removal from adult jails. So if they are in adult jail, they have to be sight and sound separated from their adult counterparts. It requires states to address disproportionate minority contact, and it also requires that kids not be locked up for those behaviors that we were talking about just a moment ago, status offenses, things that are illegal only because they haven't yet reached age 18. The JJDPA was last reauthorized in 2002, and the current version of that bill enables states to incarcerate a child if they have committed a status offense, they've gone before the court before, and the judge has said, you know, stop skipping school, they continue to skip school, they can be incarcerated through what's known as the valid court order exception or the VCO exception. A bill that's before Congress right now, S 1169, would require that states phase out their use of the valid court order exception over the next 3 years. That bill hasn't yet passed, it's still in the Senate, but it would require states to stop using that and to stop locking up kids for status offenses and truancy and things of that nature. So when we're talking about status offenses and truancy, how many folks are coming before the courts for these sort of behaviors? About 109,000 kids were petitioned to the courts in 2013 for these sorts of cases. And one of the things that CJJ has worked on extensively in recent years is trying to stop the incarceration of children for these sorts of behaviors. About 7,300 cases for status offenses resulted in detention in 2013. And what we've seen is that there is a huge overlap between status offense cases and runaway and homeless youth. You know, if you don't have stable and secure housing, it makes it much more difficult to make it to school on time, for example, or to, you know, comply with a curfew that might exist in your city. So our goal, we released in 2013 the national standards for addressing status offenses, and we've also seen in recent years that a number of states have also done work on this issue. They've done some really great work. Kentucky, for example, which was one of the leading states in terms of numbers of kids who were locked up for valid court order exception uses, has significantly decreased its incarceration of status offenders. They're really leading the way on reforms to try to address this issue and reduce incarceration. And there are a number of other states that are doing this as well. About half of all states have stopped locking children up for this. So there's some great work being done in the states, but there's still a lot that could be done on this issue. So how can we address these challenges? You know, as I mentioned, states are doing some great work, and you're going to hear in a few moments from Beth Holger-Ambrose, who's doing great work in her community as well. At the national level, a large number of organizations are also trying to tackle this issue and make sure that we can eliminate youth homelessness. As I mentioned, CJJ, with our partners, the National Network for Youth and the National League of Cities Institute for Youth Education and Families, is launching a new project today. The goals of this project are to make sure that children are receiving services instead of becoming involved with the juvenile justice system for behaviors that result from homelessness, and also trying to ensure that kids don't become homeless as a result of their involvement with the juvenile justice system. Away Home America is another project that's recently launched that's bringing together folks from across different dimensions and issue areas to try to address the issue of homelessness and youth homelessness and end it in 2020. And the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty is also working to fight the criminalization of homelessness for both youth and adults. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth. Here is my contact information as well.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear me? What I want to do is just give an overview of housing program models that we have been working with here in Minneapolis for young people experiencing homelessness and who's exiting the juvenile justice system. So just to give you an overview of what the link is, we are a nonprofit that's 25 years old, and we are based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. We have programs throughout the Twin Cities area in 3 main areas of services for youth and young families. One is a juvenile justice division, and we have a number of programs that I'll get more in-depth into as we go throughout the presentation. The second division of services we have is housing and homeless youth services. We operate 7 supportive housing programs, a drop-in center, and a street outreach program. And the third division is called Safe Harbor Division, which is an emergency shelter and housing program called Passageways, and a West Metro Regional Navigator and Safe Harbor Supportive Services programming. All of that is especially designed for youth who have experienced sex trafficking. We are governed by a 14-member board of directors, and we actually have 3 youth advisory committees that provide leadership and co-design in all of our programs, which I believe makes them much more effective than if myself and the adult staff were to create them on our own. So to give you a more in-depth view of our juvenile justice programs, and I'll also talk about housing and the intersections with that as well, I want to highlight one of our programs that's actually our largest juvenile justice program. It's called the Juvenile Supervision Center, and it's located in City Hall in downtown Minneapolis. Our Juvenile Supervision Center is open 24/7, and it's a safe and supervised place for young people between the ages of 10 and 17 who are picked up by any type of law enforcement within Hennepin County, which is the county that Minneapolis resides in. The law enforcement officers can drop off those young people at our Juvenile Supervision Center any time of the day or night, and then our staff provide a positive youth development response and social service response rather than a punitive juvenile justice response. The majority of the youth that are coming into the JSC are, as Naomi kind of talked about earlier, they're committing status offenses, livability types of low-level crimes. We also take young people who have been suspected of being sex trafficked, and then we can take 1 felony, which is car theft. We work with the young people once they get into our Juvenile Supervision Center, and then we also work with them mobily, ongoing, as well as their families afterwards to ensure that they have the right supports that they need. We know that these young people are not bad kids and aren't trying to get into trouble, but they have a lot going on in their lives, and we want to help resolve what those underlying issues are so that they can move on with their goals that they have for themselves. We also operate 2 evening reporting centers in the suburbs of Minneapolis and a power program within North Minneapolis. And those 3 programs are for young people who are between the ages of 10 and 17 who are actually court-ordered through and are referred through probation officers in Hennepin County. Those youth that are referred through higher-level crimes, mainly higher degree assault, drug or gun possession charges. And once they're referred into our program, they participate 3 to 4 months, and it's basically an alternative to detention. And so we provide basically a positive alternative program to detention. We operate the program 4 to 8 p.m. Tuesday through Saturday, and it involves a lot of restorative justice programs, case management, crisis intervention, and advocacy. And we also do a lot around education support. Power, just to let you know, is an actual gender-specific program for girls who are on juvenile probation, because we have, like many parts of the country, have seen an increase in the number of girls participating in juvenile crime, and so that is specifically geared towards their needs. The last juvenile justice programs I'll talk about is called School Matters, and it's a truancy intervention program. So young people, again, we know that largely the reasons why they're missing school is because there's something else going on in their lives. Maybe they're dealing with housing stability or homelessness, issues of abuse and neglect, or being trafficked and taken out of state or into different cities. And so we really work at, once we get our youth referred to us through our county attorney's office, our case managers work mobily and very intensively with each youth and their families who are referred to work on those underlying reasons for why the youth isn't making it to school regularly in order to improve their school attendance and their quality of life and helping them achieve their goals. So on the other end of things, that's a lot of our juvenile justice programs are geared for younger youth, like I said, between the ages of 10 and 17. And we do have a number of supportive housing programs, which I will talk about, but I believe that having stable housing is a critical component of reentering basically society or our community after being involved in the juvenile correction system. And it's also a really important piece of staying out of further criminal activity or juvenile justice systems. So I'll briefly go over, we have two main site-based programs. One is called Lindquist Apartments here in North Minneapolis. It has 24 units of permanent supportive housing for young people between the ages of 16 and 24. And then we have a Lincoln Place housing program located in Eagan, Minnesota, which is actually modeled after Lindquist Apartments. Eagan is a suburb of Minneapolis. We also have our Passageways Emergency Shelter and Housing Program, which is a site-based supportive housing and shelter program specifically for youth who have been sex trafficked. And then we also have four different scattered site housing programs. So one's called Housing First, which provides basically rental subsidies to young people through market rate landlords and supportive services in their home. We also have a rapid rehousing program throughout the Twin Cities, which provides scattered site housing and supportive services to young people experiencing homelessness. Suburban Rapid Rehousing, which is a program throughout the suburbs of Minneapolis providing scattered site housing and supportive services to young people experiencing homelessness. And then the Young Families Program, which is basically the name, but we provide housing and supportive services specifically designed for young families. So we have a lot of early childhood programming and support that goes along with that. Last but not least, we have another scattered site housing program called Project Live Out Loud, which is culturally specific for youth who identify as LGBTQ and are experiencing homelessness. So this is just a breakdown to kind of list out that we have a lot of different types of housing models within the link. And so, like I said, we have currently we have three different site-based supportive housing programs, which essentially means, for those of you that are not familiar with housing lingo, it essentially means that there are multiple housing units within an apartment building, and typically they're staffed 24/7, which our programs are, and provide a lot of on-site intensive supportive services to the young people in those programs. We're working on developing a fourth site-based program called the Young Families Program, which would be complementary towards our Scattered Site Young Families Program, and we're hoping to open that in 2018. Our Scattered Site Supportive Housing, this just lists out the programs I just talked about, so Rapid Rehousing, Suburban Rapid Rehousing, the Young Families Program, Project Live Out Loud, and Housing First. And so in total right now we have 7 housing programs for youth and a total of 187 units of housing. So one of the things I wanted to suggest is for any type of housing, whether it's youth that have been a part of the juvenile justice system and are exiting that system or not, it's critical that youth be leading the design of the program. Youth are the true experts No matter, I've been in the field many, many years, and it doesn't matter how long you've been in the field, you're continually learning, and the youth really are genuinely the people that know what's currently going on with youth culture, what is going to, best practices for working with that particular target subpopulation. And so it's really important that we value young people as the experts and not assume as adults or providers that we are. And then also programs I've found in my career to be much more successful when they're co-designed by youth. So we have, like I mentioned before, we have youth advisory committees that oversee all of our programs at the link, and those programs are made, or those advisory committees are made up of youth with lived experience of homelessness, involvement in the juvenile justice system, and or sexual exploitation. And then those young people are paid part-time staff members of the link that help to co-found and design our programs, help to oversee our programs, provide ongoing evaluation, and then they do a lot of other project work and actually work in some of those programs as well. It's really also a great way to provide opportunities for youth leadership and career development skills when you're integrating youth, genuinely integrating youth into the leadership and program design of your housing programs. And so we actually, like I said, have hired, right now we have on staff, we have 148 staff at the link, and 44 of them are youth. Some of them are advisory committee members, and some of them are peer street outreach workers or work in our drop-in center. But it's a really incredibly valuable partnership within our organization to have both adult and youth staff. The other thing that's really important within any youth program, and I'm sure many of you know this, is to really be critical about who you hire into your housing programs. Whether it's youth exiting the juvenile justice system or really any subpopulation of young people experiencing homelessness, the staff are going to make or break your program as well. So you want to make sure to hire very good, competent staff. So at the link, what we do is we recruit very strategically and diversely. We make sure that we're posting on the traditional job boards, but then we also want to make sure, for example, we oftentimes ask our youth, let them know about the job openings, and ask them if they have anybody that they could personally recommend to apply for the job. We also make sure to get the word out to all of the different cultural communities within Minneapolis to make sure that they're finding out about the job openings to ensure that we have a diverse workforce. We also have youth involved in the interview process and hiring decisions, and we ask a lot of scenario questions. So when we are actually interviewing staff, oftentimes they'll come into the link and they'll have 8 people sitting there interviewing them. Typically 6 or 7 of them might be youth, myself and or another staff, and depending on the position. And it is very telling to have youth in the interview process. They can really read people well, they have a lot of good questions, and they're able to really connect with who would be successful at engaging with young people who are experiencing homelessness. So that is incredibly valuable to have youth involved in your interviewing process for staff within housing programs. Hiring based on experience, professional and or life is a little bit prioritized over academic degrees at the link. Academic degrees are very good and of course great to have too, but what I've found in my career is that really that lived experience combined with professional experience is really what makes a staff successful in this particular field. Academic degrees definitely help, but if someone has only an academic degree and maybe an internship over someone who's had 5 years of experience working with youth in crisis or youth experiencing homelessness, we would definitely choose the person that had the professional experience as well. And by lived experience, I also mean that it's important to hire a mix of staff, I believe, that have actually experienced things like homelessness or involvement in the juvenile justice system or sex trafficking. Those staff members are invaluable. They also need to have, of course, the professional experience as well, but that combination makes for a really great staff member within housing programs. It's also important to hire staff that are grounded and experienced in housing first, harm reduction, trauma-informed care, and positive youth development. We know that punitive approaches do not work with young people, and so it's really important that we're hiring staff that buy into all of these philosophies. We, of course, provide training in all of these areas as well, and we definitely think that that's valuable and important. But if someone is applying for a job, we ask a lot of scenario questions to kind of tease out where their philosophies are, lying around these particular areas, because that will also make or break somebody as a good fit for working within youth housing programs. It's really important. The reason why I kind of focusing on the high quality staff is because in housing programs, especially the site-based programs, but also the scattered site, you're literally working where young people live. And so it's really important, even more so than any other type of service, to make sure that you're hiring very good, respectful, competent staff that are grounded in trauma-informed care and harm reduction and all the best practices that I just mentioned. The other thing I wanted to mention was the importance of strength-based services. So a lot of times, obviously, young people who have experienced significant levels of trauma are looked at as delinquents, they're, street youth, they're all prostitutes, they're all kinds of negative connotations that we should never be putting labels on our young people as. But we want to make sure when they're coming into our programs that we're looking at them as the amazing, resilient, smart, strong young people that they are. And so it's really important to kind of model your programs around this. And this is all coming from not just myself, but like I said, our youth advisory teams that help us co-create all of our programming. So these are some tips that we've found that work well at the link, is to provide very individualized case management and goal planning. That one might not be new to everybody, but to really have the youth drive that process. I know sometimes it can be frustrating as a case manager that you might think, well, this is the direction that you should be going. They should be doing their college applications and FAFSA, and then they should be doing X, Y, and Z. But young people, in the nature of adolescent brain development and also with all the extra trauma, may go up and down and may move forward and backwards in their process. And it's really important to let them guide that process, even if it seems like it may not be going the exact direction that the case manager wants it to. It's a natural part of adolescence. So very important that you let the youth drive the case management and goal planning process. Triage and coordination with youth POs. So this is specific to youth who are exiting the juvenile justice system. So youth that are exiting the juvenile justice system that come into our housing programs that are referred by a probation officer, we are very careful to make sure that our staff know exactly what are all of the basically requirements of the young person's parole and any stipulations around that, around sobriety, around no contact orders, anything else. Just making sure that we know that so that we don't accidentally place the youth in a housing program or a situation or activity where they could potentially violate or put their parole status in a harmful place. Supporting youth on conditions of parole, we're really trying to be good about working with young people, because oftentimes young people, not always, but sometimes young people really don't want to follow the conditions of their parole, and so it's our job not to necessarily be their, obviously, parole officer, but just to at least help them kind of think through things that might, think through potential consequences or pros and cons of what would happen if they choose not to follow their parole, and do that from a strength-based lens, and then let them make the decision, but at least let them know what their kind of options might look like. We also provide access to legal services. In Minneapolis, we have a great partner called the Youth Law Project that does helps us with so many different client situations, and we just really appreciate that. And I believe some of them are on the call, but I just want to say they are a great partner, and so they help us a lot with legal services and court advocacy. We also have I think what's also really critical is to have trauma-informed, youth-centered mental health therapy and chemical dependency treatment. And what we have found is that although we have great partners in the community as well, what the youth have told us over and over within our housing programs is they do really like it when they have someone that can come out, like a mental health therapist that can come out mobily and meet with them where they feel comfortable versus going into an actual mental health clinic, and or having one on site in the housing program. So some of our housing programs actually have chemical dependency counselors and mental health therapists on site that specialize specifically in working with youth who have experienced homelessness and sex trafficking, and that's been very successful. And we've had a lot of good engagement through that. As we know, a lot of therapy and things like that are done through the natural milieu day-to-day of a program, so having a mental health practitioner in the building is really helpful, and is also helpful to our other case management and front desk staff and shift staff. We also have parenting supports, which I think are critical for young people who have families. It's important to remember that we want to provide kind of two different sets of services but align them closely together, which is we want to provide services specific to the adolescent or transition age parent of the household, but we also want to make sure we're providing early childhood. And the reason I say early childhood is the young families we serve, their children are babies through age 5 typically, so it is that early childhood range. So we want to provide programming for them too and not forget that they're part of that household. So we provide early childhood assessments, screening, specific programming and curriculum, as well as field trips and things like that for the young families. I think it's also important to address providing culturally specific activities and programming, and to have youth address help you figure out what they want and need, you know, depending on which youth are coming into your programming. They have a lot of good ideas about how to connect specifically with certain cultural activities or other organizations. It's also good to really model and help young people who are oftentimes having their first housing situation with life skills. And so we do that in 2 different ways. We actually have groups where we teach life skills, and we do some individual work through case management. But what I will say is we do the most life skills, I feel like, when it's one-on-one, when we're visiting young people in their apartments and kind of just helping them learn what the skills that are needed to basically keep that apartment and maintain their housing. So the other thing I wanted to touch base about here is the difference between site-based and scattered site programs. And I want to say that both programs, I feel like, both program models of housing for youth exiting juvenile justice are critical. It's not that one's better than the other. There's different youth have different needs, and so we definitely want to have both models available to young people. The benefits of site-based programs are that it can be a better fit for youth with higher barriers if a young person has severe mental health issues, chemical dependency, and need that 24/7 support. Those types of youth actually fit in really well into our site-based programs. It's also a good fit. We see unfortunately, a lot of young people who are experiencing homelessness have also been victimized by domestic violence, and some are former gang-involved youth that are trying to leave gang life, and it becomes very difficult if they're in a scattered site program to have their former gang members come into their apartment and beat them up or steal from them, or to have a visit from a former partner who is violent towards you and gets you evicted from your scattered site housing unit. So we find if we know that a young person has unfortunately experienced domestic violence or is trying to leave a particular gang, then we really try as much as possible to have those youth move into our site-based programs as long as that's a fit for what they want to do. We also, in general, can monitor safety much better within site-based programs because we have staff 24/7, and we provide a lot of on-site supportive services and activities every day. So we have calendars of all the different activities that are going on, field trips, things like that. And so it's a little bit easier to have all of those things because you can have them right in the community living room space within that building. And then also site-based programs typically are a little bit easier to get youth into because typically if the nonprofit or the property owner who owns the building has bought into the fact that this building is specifically designed for young people experiencing homelessness, so they might be more lenient about things like youth with criminal records, for example, or lack of income or lack of rental history. The challenges of site-based programs is that 24/7 staffing is obviously a little bit more of an expensive housing model. You also, if you own the building, you have to pay for property upkeep and maintenance, and it also takes a lot of staff time, and you have to have staff positions dedicated to that. And if you don't own the property, that means most likely you're either leasing or you're working with a property owner or a developer. And what we have found is there's a lot of great property owners and developers, and their expertise is building and maintaining buildings, but their expertise is not necessarily in providing youth housing. And so sometimes it can be very challenging to work through like situations where the property manager may think a youth is acting violently or using substances on the property or things like that. And so whereas we know that a lot of those behaviors are because of trauma, and so we always try to advocate with property managers to allow the young person to stay in the building. So those are some, and not all, every property management company and developer is different, but it is very, if you're going to be opening a housing program, very critical to find out what those property owners and developers requirements are, or what their standards are going to be for youth getting into the housing program or staying in the housing program, and making sure it aligns with the vision of best practices of positive youth development, housing first, harm reduction. So scattered site programs, which typically what that means is that they're programs where you might have vouchers or rental subsidies that you're, as an organization, receiving through a grant, and then you pay those out to market rate landlords that you find to work with the young people who are experiencing homelessness within your programs. And those typically can go, depending on the subsidy, they can go anywhere from 24 months to ongoing and not have a permanent end date. And in these programs, typically the services are provided mobily and within the young person's apartment. So the benefits of scattered site programs are that youth can transition in place if they would like to. Youth are able to learn about how to be a good renter while they're being a renter, which is a huge, great way to learn. Tenant rights and how to take care of their own apartment while they're living there with support from staff. There seems to be, although I'm not an expert at this across the country like Jasmine would be, but it seems to be that there is more funding dedicated towards rapid rehousing and some of the other rental subsidies or funding that can be used to provide rental subsidies for scattered site programs right now. And then also, you do not have to deal with scheduling and staffing a 24/7 program. So those are definitely all benefits. The other big benefit is that youth really can participate in the housing search process and learn about that and learn how to negotiate with landlords too. Challenges of scattered site housing programs can be that it's sometimes very difficult to find market rate landlords that especially depending if your community has a low vacancy rate with market rate apartments. And so it's sometimes difficult to find market rate landlords to rent to youth without or with poor credit and rental histories, criminal backgrounds, or other barriers. Time and resources spent on rehousing youth if a landlord does want to terminate a lease or evict a youth. So we believe obviously in housing first. So even when a young person does get evicted from, or their lease gets terminated, typically they're not evicted from our programs. Typically we can do a lease termination and avoid an eviction or unlawful detainer. But if they do get their lease terminated by a landlord, then we spend that time and energy and resources on rehousing the young person instead of having them re-experience homelessness. So that does take a lot of time with some of the particular youth in our programs. It also might not be a good fit for youth, like I said earlier, who are dealing with domestic violence or who are trying to leave gang life. The other thing that we found to be helpful, or another option is, so for some of our Housing First programs, we are master leasing buildings, which means that the link goes into a lease for all of the units in one particular building with the owner of that building. And this is has been successful, although it does have, like everything else, pros and cons. So the pros are that it is definitely cost effective. It's easier to house youth with high barriers in, because the nonprofit who has the master lease is actually the one that gets to decide who's going in. So that's been great for us, especially with young people that have criminal backgrounds. We've had great success housing them in these programs. It also has a secured set number of housing units that you know is going to be open to young people in your program instead of having to rely on vacancy within market rate landlords. The cons are that you're responsible for the maintenance and upkeep typically, except for large machinery. And so you have to make sure that you're budgeting that into your operating budget for the program, as well as dedicating staff to doing some of that work. And then also, it might sometimes be difficult to find a property investment company that's willing to work with nonprofits. So we're fortunate that we do have one in Minneapolis, but not every community might necessarily have that. And that is it. I just want to thank everybody for joining the webinar, and also just thank the co-panelists. It's a real privilege to be on the panel with all of you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Beth, and thanks to Jasmine and Naomi as well. Really excited to have such a distinguished panel of experts with us today. We have about 20 minutes remaining for Q&A, and we've gotten a bunch of questions. Encourage everybody to keep putting them into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. The first question we want to tackle, we've got a couple of questions around data collection and data tracking, and wanted to pose this to the group around sort of what are the key metrics that you're using to track homelessness and juvenile justice involvement. How do you what kind of measures are you looking at related to that? And then kind of on a related note, sort of how are you sharing this data among justice systems, homelessness service providers, foster care system, kind of what are best practices around data collection and data sharing related to this? Someone want to tackle that first?
This is Jasmine. I can talk to that very briefly from the sort of how we're approaching this at the federal level, and then I would suspect probably that the state and local level has much better examples of how this is actually being operationalized. I think one of the challenges we have, and I noted this earlier, is that we are still working to share data and actually understand what data is available. On the juvenile justice side, OJJDP is actually funding a new initiative to develop juvenile reentry measurement standards. And so this will include developing, testing, and then disseminating a set of practice and outcome measures for juvenile reentry. And we expect that that is going to be an opportunity for us to then collaborate or coordinate a little more on the data that they will be able to collect and track, and then line that up with the data we have on the homelessness side. I think similar to the partnerships that we're seeing in various communities between local continuums of care and school districts where they have developed data sharing agreements, we would expect that there are also examples of juvenile justice service providers who are perhaps partnering with either the continuum of care or even with their child welfare agency, and through some kind of agreement would be sharing information about, I think certainly on the child welfare side, you probably do have more jurisdictions that at least are sharing information about the dual population or the overlap population. There just really isn't, not that I'm aware of, certainly on the federal level, any formal guidance or examples of that. We're starting, and like I said, I think that the best examples we have now are the increasing partnerships between homeless services and education, which we would see as an opportunity to then model that to both child welfare and juvenile justice and potentially other youth serving programs. I think at a very basic level, we're interested in looking at what are the services that young people are accessing, and then thinking about outcomes across a number of domains. So connections to family, permanent connections, connections to employment, connections to school, length of stay in programs, how quickly are they turning over, and then where are they coming when they're entering a program, where are they coming from, and then where are they going to when they leave? Are they leaving because they've actually have now safe and stable housing to go to, or are they leaving because they didn't complete the program, because there were requirements that made it not low barrier for them? I think so. Program by program, I think organizations are starting to collect that. It's just that now we have to work through some of the challenges that exist around confidentiality, and then how do you actually exchange that information and then use it in a way that's informative at a community level and then a state level to give you a bigger picture of what's happening.
This is Naomi. Just to add to that, I will say that data collection is something that I think states generally, they're trying really hard to improve, but it can be a challenge across juvenile justice generally, in part because of the multiple agencies and multiple points of contact that are involved in the system, and getting those multiple systems to communicate can be a challenge. The Senate bill that I mentioned earlier, S 1169, does include some additional data collection provisions that would be helpful to the population that we're discussing in terms of youth who are both homeless and juvenile justice involved. And it also would require additional reentry planning to ensure that once children left a juvenile justice detention facility, that they would have a plan in place that ensured that they had a safe and secure place to go to.
Great, thank you. So a second question that we've gotten a couple of queries around is the foster care system and sort of the ins and outs of what that means when a young person ages out of foster care. We know each state has its own sort of policy and aging out process. Most states are between age 18 to 21, and I think there's a growing trend towards raising that age to 21. But could someone kind of speak to the sort of the intricacies of what happens when a young person ages out of foster care? What supports are in place to make sure that they're not just kind of dropped off without a safety net, without any additional support? What efforts are made to ensure that young person has connections to supportive, stable, affordable housing options?
So this is Jasmine. Happy to jump in with the first one. Under Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, so that was the federal law that was enacted in 2008 that gave states the option to extend foster care benefits to youth up to age 21 and to receive federal funding for doing that. Not all states have taken advantage of that, but as Emily said, an increasing number of states are doing that. What that means, though, I think oftentimes is it tends to it's pushing the exit date from 18 to 21. We're not necessarily changing the outcomes for young people. Federal funding, child welfare funding, does allow for aftercare supports, and so that gets implemented in different ways to support young people so that they're just not left. I think, perhaps there may be this sense that, okay, for a young person on their 18th birthday, that's it, there's nothing left for them. And I would say absolutely historically that was certainly probably the case for many young people, 18th birthday without a plan and really left on their own to either try and reconnect on their own to family or friends, or to end up in a shelter on the street. That is why the discussion on transition planning is critical, and it is about transition planning starting much earlier for young people, especially when we know which youth are not going to be able to go home when they leave foster care at age 18, 19, 20, 21. And so really thinking through what are the supports, that's where the coordination between child welfare and other programs, whether those are employment programs, post-secondary programs, to ensure that young people have the supports they need. That's also a critical place for housing programs like transitional housing, or like access to, as Beth mentioned, more the short-term financial assistance, for example, like rapid rehousing, but really a robust case management support. And so that gets implemented in different ways. It's certainly not consistent. I think there are some minimum standards, and the Fostering Connections Act attempts to outline that. There are some good examples of transition plan documents that are available on the Child Welfare Information Gateway. It's a really good resource, and a number of states have actually developed resources to address the requirement for transition plans to give states more guidance within the Child Welfare Agency. So again, thinking about it from typically age 15 or so, sort of a long-term transition plan, so that when young people actually leave the system, they have a much greater likelihood of success.
Great, thank you. And so one additional question, kind of on a related note. We talked a little bit about emergency shelters and sort of thinking about youth who have nowhere to go and what their options are for emergency shelters. Beth, you kind of ran through a bunch of different housing options and the pros and cons of each. I'm not sure if you've had experience sort of connecting young people to emergency shelters and what the challenges and opportunities are there. But I'm not sure if that's something you could speak to, or maybe Naomi or Jasmine.
Sure.
Great.
Okay, what I will say about emergency shelter is, similarly to housing, of course, we lack a capacity of, in Minnesota for sure, of emergency shelter beds for the number of young people that need them. But what we find works really well is if we do connect a young person, most oftentimes it's through street outreach or a drop-in center or school or youth themselves that'll get connected in. And we actually have an app here in Minnesota or the Minneapolis area that is called the YSN or Youth Services Network app that shows, it's a web app and also one that youth can download onto their phones to see when an emergency shelter bed becomes open or where they are open at each of our shelters in the Twin Cities area. So that's really helpful. But I'm not going, I want to be real with everybody and say we do know that it's tough sometimes because there may not be an emergency shelter bed open when a young person needs one. But the whole, I think the hope, at least of the role of emergency shelter within our communities is to really help young people have a short-term stay in an emergency shelter where they can get that support and assessment around determining whether or not they can be safely reunified with family or caregivers or a safe adult in their life, or whether or not they would be eligible for foster care or child welfare services, or if they are, if neither of those two are an option, then referring them through coordinated entry into a housing program, a longer-term housing program. I don't know if that helps or not, but.
No, that was very helpful, Beth. Thank you so much. And it was really interesting to hear about the app. I think that's something that we haven't heard about before and a really great way to use technology to sort of build awareness and help connect people to places to stay. So one other question we received was sort of around fines and fees for incarceration and detention and monitoring, and the impact that that has on a young person's ability to secure housing because they're sort of paying these fines and fees and other kind of monetary things that they're having to pay back before being able to put money towards, housing. Wondering, Naomi, if you've had any experience with that and any kind of best practices or some of the ways to address some of those challenges that you've seen, or different counties or local systems that have maybe done away with that sort of practice?
Sure, and we released a model policy guide earlier that addresses this issue in part. CJJ has taken a position where we, agree completely with this person who posted the question, that fines and fees and restitution can pose serious challenges for young people and their families, and especially foster youth who might not have someone who is able to front the cash for them. Our position is that they shouldn't be used, and there are a large number of communities that are doing away with the fines and fees. We often hold up Florida, which has a great civil citation program, and their program does not include fines and fees. It includes, doing community service and things like that. So there are other ways that someone can pay people back, if you will, but it's not in a monetary fashion. And so sort of that creative thinking of other ways that someone can sort of help out their community without necessarily being financially indebted.
Fantastic. This is really exciting, and there sounds like there's a lot of resources available both through the Interagency Council's website, the CJJ's website. Minneapolis is clearly doing some really exciting things, so encourage everyone on the line to take advantage of these resources. One other question that's come up in our chat box has been around eligibility for housing services and whether a person an individual have to spend sort of a night on the streets before they become eligible for housing services, and what supports or interventions are available to prevent that from happening, and sort of prevent homelessness from happening in the first place, so that they don't have to demonstrate that they are homeless before having access to these types of services. I'm wondering, maybe Jasmine, if you have any information about that, about effective kind of prevention services, or Naomi possibly?
Sure, I can start and then turn it over to Naomi. Happy to share. So I know that the slides from this presentation will be shared. I think it would also be helpful to share some of the guidance that HUD has released regarding eligibility for programs, which is very different than who gets counted in the point in time count. And oftentimes I think a lot of the young people that we're talking about here are in fact eligible for services. But I think in terms of the prevention piece, that is where the early planning, the clear transition planning, the partnerships with whether it's child welfare or other community-based supports is critical to ensure that young people are actually not in that situation.
And I would just add in terms of the prevention piece as well that there are, creative problem solving and thinking again can really help address the issue. New Jersey, for example, there are communities where they have agreements in place with children who have run away previously and they might be at risk of being homeless and run away again. So they have agreements in place, pre-planned, that if the police find them on the streets, these children aren't taken to a detention center. There's an agreed upon relative or an agreed upon family friend where the child can stay instead so that they don't have to be on the streets that evening.
Great, thank you so much. This has been extremely helpful information, and we had a couple questions about the toolkit that Jasmine mentioned that's going to be released by DOJ and OJJDP. Just wanted to let you all know that the projected release date for that is by the end of the year, and there's not going to be a cost, it'll be public. And then wanted to reiterate Naomi's roadmap and initiative with NLC. So Naomi, I assume they can just go to your website and get more information about that.
Yes.
Great.
And that is
really. Oh,
sorry. For folks who need it, that's www.juvjustice.org.
Fantastic. And at the end of each presenter's slides, there's a contact information slide with their email and phone number, and really encourage everyone to reach out. We know we weren't able to get to all the questions. We had some really, really interesting questions, and we'll sort of mull those over here, but encourage you to reach out to the panelists if you have further follow-ups. And also just wanted to remind everyone that this PowerPoint and webinar will be posted on the Justice Center website and potentially the CJJ website, so you all can view it and share it with your colleagues as you find useful. But again, just wanted to really thank all the panelists and presenters. We really, really appreciated you taking the time to share your wisdom and experiences with us, especially given the importance of this issue. And we look forward to hosting another webinar on youth and young adults and how to improve outcomes for them. So just thank you all for participating, and have a great rest of the day.